Welcome back to another episode of our Mega-lo-Mania rewrite in Unreal Engine. Continuing straight off from where we were yesterday, more or less. So yesterday we were working on the research menu and we're getting the interaction with the adding of the designers and kind of just the whole process of performing research or uh, performing designs. Research sounds a lot nicer from that perspective, but the game calls them kind of designs and designers. And there was a couple of issues that we ran into as we were going through them, difficulties that we kind of just brushed past to continue to make progress. But the end result was the ability to allocate designers to our particular task and kind of have that reflect in the player controller and even kind of animate the clock to spin round, although it span round quite wildly. Now, one of the key things that was an issue in that process was the lack of right click and therefore the lack of ability to deallocate the designers. And it turned out that we were using if I find the right container, I think it's this one here, and yeah, so this one, we were using a image originally to handle the tech man icon. So if I just make this visible, and visible there. Yeah, so this was the original one. As you can see, there's a second version here, which I'll go through in a minute. But we were using the click on the tech man, and it has a mouse down event. But there was no way that I could find, neither at the time of trying to code it or after the stream, that I could find on how to handle right click on that particular element. And without the right click, you can't remove the designers that you've allocated, which is quite fundamental to how the game's supposed to work. Now, potentially, we could have implemented a different solution. We could have had plus, minus icons, things like that. We could work around it. But kind of trying to go for like at the moment. Things like adding additional methods to add or remove designers may be ways that we can improve on the game later on. But before that, we kind of want all the fundamentals in place. So I ignored the fact that we couldn't right click and continued to implement the allocation of designers. But obviously once the stream finished, I did some more research and trying to figure out what was wrong. Now, out of all the input style widgets that this editor allows, particularly in relation to buttons, I did add a button. I don't think it's still here. And a button actually allows you to handle the on clicked, on pressed, on released. So a button, and I think actually, yeah, maybe yesterday we did use the button in the end, but the button allows the click, the hold, and the release, and the image didn't. So yes, it was the button that we used. Did so many changes yesterday, I can't even remember what we did. Nonetheless, the button allows us to press, hold, and release, and allocate until such time as you release. But again, there was no way to handle right click. I couldn't find any information within the player controller about which mouse button you clicked, and a lot of the solutions I saw online that was trying to handle right clicks on buttons seemed a bit kind of workaround-y, and it didn't really kind of feel right to do it. But that said, after looking at all of the inputs and containers that actually have events you can bind to, the only one that appears to handle right click in any good way is if we find the right one, I think it's the border panel, not panel, where is it? This one, the border. So if we drag a new border in here just to demonstrate, it has a mouse button down, a mouse button up, move, and double click. Again, one of the only ones that I seem to remember has a double click. But more importantly, if we bind to the mouse button down event by creating a new binding, what we actually get there is this mouse event, and from the mouse event we can determine which mouse button has been pressed. That allows us to do the left and right clicks. Now, as you can see, I've created a second version of our time, tech man and tech icon. And what I've actually done there is encompassed all of that set of components into their own widget, which I'm calling the current design within this context. And the original one is here. It still probably works for the most part, but I've kept it hidden. And one thing that I've kind of learnt yesterday while working on this is you can hide it in the editor here, but that obviously doesn't change the visibility within the game, as is kind of hinted to by the tooltip. And we can hide it by doing hidden here, but again, as the tooltip says, which I don't read till after it doesn't work, hidden means that it still occupies the space. So it's a bit misleading, because if we show it in the editor here, so that makes it disappear and it removes its space, when we actually play it, if this was left visible, that element would come back. So if we just press play, I think it's in a state where it will play, we can see that it's still there. So the key thing is, while it is hidden and it does explicitly say it's hidden in the editor actually doesn't occupy, or the element doesn't occupy the space that it does, which means all the alignments are off. These aren't where they really will be, because that element takes up space and is visible. And then if we show it again within the editor and then change the visibility here, this actually affects the visibility within the game. If we specify hidden, what we can see is that it doesn't actually hide it. It's still visibly there within the editor, but if we play, we can see we've got this blank space. So hidden hides all the elements, or hides the parent element and therefore its children, but it doesn't prevent it from taking space. Good if you want an icon that comes and goes, but you don't want the whole view to rearrange every time that happens. So if you want something to actually be hidden, for all intents and purposes, collapsed is the option you want. So if we run that again, we can see that now it's completely gone, it's not taking up space, and that's kind of what we want it to be when we're kind of working on a second revision of that. So this original revision has all the bits and pieces pretty much in the way that it was yesterday, but not completely, because I did do some prototyping and testing around the solution within that area. But I've left it there just to make sure that I've got that reference. Now, the main thing is that we've got this current design widget, which is a custom widget. And within this view, we'll just delete that one as well, just so it's not in the way. Within this widget, sorry, we have called it the current design, but it's actually called the task blueprint. And I think that's, sorry, just get rid of the event bind that we created for testing our border, get rid of that. So the task blueprint, if we look at it in the designer, it's a full widget, and inside there's simply just a horizontal bar, and it's kind of built up just very similar to how we had the kind of bits and pieces built up for the main research widget. So we've got a spacer on the left, we have our task image as we've called it here, and then we have the multiplication image. In this case it's not a variable, because we're kind of saying that the entire widget here will be shown or not shown depending on if there is a task ongoing, so we don't have to explicitly hide the multiplication or the equals sign. We have a population counter, which is our border container, which we know we can handle the on mouse button down and on mouse button up events for. And within there we have a vertical box, and we have our tech man image, or tech level image as we've called it within this context, and our allocated population text. And we've kind of put the text and the tech level image next to each other, and as we can see with the time, So we've got another, the equals image, then we've got another vertical box, our time image, our remaining time text, and our infinity image, which is actually currently hidden not only in the editor, but also within the visibility of collapse. So we can show that and see that that's what that is there. And then we have just a space on the right. So it's all of our kind of key components to build up this task widget. And the basis of this is that, firstly, it kind of encapsulates all the code that is required to update it. There was quite a few bits and pieces that we were adding to the research menu, as we've called it, to facilitate the functionality here. But secondly, the next advantage is that within the game there's 3 occurrences of this style where we have something going on, the multiplication, the tech man with allocated people, an equals, and a timer. Firstly is the research, which is where we've started, and secondly is in the building projects, as they call it, or construction, which in this case you can construct the mine. And again, that kind of widget there effectively is exactly what we've got within the editor. So we want something that we can reuse both in the context of research and in the context of building. And finally, the third case would be with the factories later on in the game, where you can actually construct the more advanced weapons like airplanes and tanks, or cannons actually, and that appears on the right hand side here. So you have to construct the factory, and then you also have to construct the individual things. It reuses this task widget that we've created. So that's the basis of why we've created it, for future proofing and encapsulating the code. Now, I have partly implemented it to what we want it to do, but it was taking quite a bit of time to re-implement all the logic, and there were certain parts of it I was trying to kind of improve on from the previous part. So what we have at the moment is our primary event graph for this widget on construction gets a reference to the player controller and casts it to the appropriate player controller type. Doing that, as we've done previously, allows us to use the MLM player controller's functionality without having to cast it every time we need it. So we've got that permanent reference created immediately. And within this widget we have 3 setting functions. The first one, setting the task, so we can ignore that part of it because that part was work in progress, but the main part is this bit, setting the task. Now the task consists of a name, basically an identifier of what that task is. In the research context it will be performing research, in the construction context it'll be what you're building, and so on and so forth. And we also have a sprite, and the sprite is what we put as the task image. So we set that using the same mechanism as we had before, making the bush with a sprite and setting it on the image. We've just put this sequence in place so we can do 1 and then 2 things. There was a third, but there is no longer a third. But we could put those 2 things kind of in a row or down. I think because there was a third at one point, it was kind of 1, 2, 3, and it looks smarter that way. But this part doesn't belong here. And it's, as I say, I kind of was going down that route and then I've changed my mind, so we'll cover that in a moment. We also have set allocated population, so that's setting the population allocation, which is this number here. It takes in account, which is just the amount of population that should be set. We do the conversion to text with the minimum of 2 digits, so we get that leading 0. And then we set it on the appropriate text box, which is our allocated population text box. And finally we have a set remaining time. Haven't quite finished this, well certainly haven't tested it, but basically this says, given a amount of time left, if it is greater than or equal to 0, which is true, we set the time, again to string with a leading 0 on the text box. We set the visibility for the text box, remaining time text, to visible, and we set the visibility of the infinity image to collapse. That makes it completely hidden. And then if the value is 0 or less, not that it would ever be 0 in our case, but if it is therefore 0, we follow the false branch, which simply sets the visibility of the text to collapse. and the visibility of the infinity image to visible. Now we could set the text to an empty string or something, but that's unnecessary because once we change the time, we'll come back here and reset the time anyway. So as I say, I haven't actually executed that yet, but it at least looks right. And then finally, those are our kind of external interface type functions, which we are going to tie up in a moment. But we also have the mouse button up and the mouse button down. We'll start with the down. So mouse button down occurs, we use the mouse event to check is the mouse button down for the left and right, and for them we pass them on to these appropriate branches. Now if it's the left mouse button, we basically call an event or function on the player controller. So we haven't used an event to get the thing that's happening to the player controller, because we have a reference to the player controller anyway, and because we are simply needing to tell something what to do, and it will always because it's a player interaction, it makes sense that it would always go via the player controller. In this context, we're just simply calling that function. So we're calling a set allocate population, which is our nice generic name of what we're doing, and we're basically giving it a category of a task. And again, I'll cover this in the player controller in a moment, but we've got these categories that where population can be allocated to. If it's a right click, we simply deallocate the population, so it's effectively almost exactly the same thing, just a slightly different event, still telling it which task it is, and these tasks should actually be within this context design. Yeah, see, I see a gap here because this is meant to be generic. This widget as a whole. The issue is that it doesn't know that it should be representing design. I did have the enum actually, and I did remove the enum again. One of those scenarios where I've added something and not quite sure why it was there, and then I've removed it and then realised why I put it there in the first place. So the mouse up doesn't care whether it's left or right mouse button, because it just calls the end allocate deallocate population, and again in our case it is for the research. Now for this enumeration to work correctly, we need to actually tell the widget for what type of task it's for. So within the set task method, I will put the enum that I took off earlier back. So I have a variable name of task type, which I think is an enum. Called it meta type in this case. And we set that to the task type we pass in. So the arguments will be type first, and then the name of it. The name is what other components we're going to use to figure out what do you do about it, or when it finishes, what do we do, that kind of thing. There's a potential that we don't need both type and name, depending on exactly what the name will be in various cases. Since we're setting the sprite and the name, the name may end up being more what the meta type is of these three choices, but I haven't quite figured out what the right process is in that case. So we're just going to stick with storing both a name and a type, and kind of see where we end up with that. So we'll just check out the changes to the player controller in light of those changes there. So this is the original player controller code. We can see we've got the original event bindings that we created, our start allocate and end allocate designers. They are now no longer bound to the event begin play at the time. We have the original events, but what I found was that a slightly cleaner way is, because these are kind of entry points, perhaps even functions I suppose, within the player controller. we can create a custom event that can, as we saw, be called by something, in this case our click events on the task, but they don't actually have to exist as event dispatchers. So our task can call the appropriate function, and this can just happen straight away. End allocate, deallocate population should provide a task. Okay, yes. So it's not quite here, is it? Where did I put that? Yeah. So it's in the event graph. I was looking at the wrong thing. So it actually starts here. So we've got our start allocation, population, deallocate, and we just switch on the task type, and then if the task type is design, we call the appropriate function that we were looking at before, or the event, custom event, within the designer's graph. And the reason we've done that is that the task widget will say you need to allocate certain people to certain things, but the theory was that the name would be the research that you're doing, the building you're constructing, the thing that you're manufacturing. But if we just pass that through, then the player controller would have to know what all of those things are, what all of the research that you can do is. Hence the enum. We can just map that enum to one of those three things, and then we can call the appropriate allocate function using the same kind of inputs. So if we go to the designers now, we can see currently that we handle all those three things, and we currently just print a string. So that's kind of the next bit to fill in. And I think that covers all the kind of basics that we're going to touch today with regards to fixing up the research menu. But the main purpose is trying to make this task widget generic enough so we can use it for research and construction, and obviously tying it correctly with a player controller so the interaction works a bit smoother than it did yesterday with the multiple events that we had, and perhaps didn't necessarily need. Within the task, we have the is it yeah, so I haven't set up the image array for the timer yet either, so that's something to do. So within the, just want to make sure I'm clear on my next step, within the research menu, I have actually added the current design to the main widget tree, and that means we don't have to create it dynamically, it's just available to us. So I certainly don't need that one, because that one's going to be doing the update of the timer. We are in the event graph, so we do the player controller casting. Again, this is within the research menu, and that's handling the old way of setting up the original current research as it was. So we'll break that as well. So we're not changing any of the original stuff, but we keep the code around until we're sure that we've kind of replicated the original behavior. And obviously a number of these variables we have, or the widgets they represent, aren't going to be necessary once we've tidied things up. So what we have working at the moment is we can still go into our menu, in and out of our menu. We can click down on our left click down on our men, and we get that little bit of text. We can let go, and the right click, and we can let go. So the events for the little man work correctly, but nothing else does. Not even to the point of showing the technologies, apparently. Did I disconnect that? I think that was part of the graph. Yeah, that one there. So we'll actually tie that one up. So we'll deal with what's currently being researched a bit later on once we've actually got that component working. Let's make sure that that works now. Yeah, so we're still seeing the text from the previous one, so we'll definitely get rid of that once we've handled the click correctly. So the task effectively has these three key functions, and the theory is that the parent widget would particularly, it will call the set task once a task has been set, and it would call set allocated population or set remaining time as or when they need to change. And the primary reason we're doing it outside of this component is that means that this component doesn't need to know which population set it needs to use for a particular task, particularly since it turns out that with researching you can only research one thing, with manufacturing you can only manufacture one thing, but when it comes to buildings or the construction level part, if there were multiple choices here, you could allocate people to building each individual thing, because when you have them here, we actually get the mine shown in this bottom corner, we get the lab shown in that space, and we get the factory in this space. So you can in theory have 3 buildings running at the same time with a research and a construction, or and manufacturing if you didn't have the factory building in progress. So there needs to be a way of ensuring that something else that should know about the tasks can control the population. So let's see where we are again. We've got the click on a technology. So we're going to first work on getting that icon updated so the technology renders correctly, and getting rid of the other bits of text, which I think is that box there. So we'll make that, yep, make that collapsed so it doesn't show up. And when we go back into the graph, we render our available technologies, and in here we get all the available technologies from our data table. We create the appropriate image widget for each of them, bind to their click event, and we're setting the data on the old stuff. Was that the new stuff? Set data. No, that's the new one. That's fine. So we. Yeah, this is the click, so we need to go to the click event for that particular tech. Now this one is doing a lot. It re-gets the technology, but then it does all this stuff to figure out what should or shouldn't be shown in terms of the widgets and the inner parts of it. All these different elements are made visible when you click on something. But with our new implementation, I think all of that is not required based on our current flow. Now we're actually getting the name of the technology to actually perform the lookup in the data table, and we need our current design because our current design has the functions we need. So the first one we want to call is the set task. That tells us what we're doing. And we'll take the name, and we'll take the sprite, and we'll make sure that it's a technology. Yeah, must be using the wrong enumeration there, because we don't want a meta type, we want the population task. So back over here, that one should be the population task. Doesn't matter what its default is, but we'll leave it as. Yeah, so we picked the wrong type there as well. That's fine. Okay, so we've set that correctly now to the right one. And back over here, we want to make sure that it's a design that we're doing here. So we set the task first. That's obviously not going to change anything visually. That one. Keep those for now, I think. So we've set the task, and then we also want to I don't think we actually want to do anything else. We do need to make it visible, actually. Although obviously it currently is visible, it won't be visible once we've kind of got all the other bits sorted out. So that should change our image now when we click on the appropriate image. Yep, so that's working just as we expect. And a slight bit of a wobble there when it selects it, but again, problem for a different day. That may actually just be that image is slightly off, so that's not a problem. And we also want it to default to the infinity, but we should do that in this context, because we want it to actually default to the infinity, not be set to it. So that will be collapsed, and the infinity symbol will be visible. Now if we run that, that's how it's set up. By making the numbers part of the vertical box for the man or the timer, it's been easier to center them according to the image above, so they fit a little bit better. So we also want to make that collapsed by default. That means when we go in here, yes, we don't have that space, we need to fill that in, but when we click it, we don't get the awkward bow and arrow that we didn't need. Now, normally, if you can see behind, there's a little minus here and the man image, so we also at some point need to add in basically just the other thing that's a kind of blank person. Because that doesn't necessarily have any functionality, we'll leave that out for now and focus on trying to get the current design thing working. So we'll ignore the fact that when we go into it, it's empty. We're more concerned about when we select something, it works. So now we need to allocate or deallocate people. That actually pushes all the way over to the player controller, where we're outputting these strings, because it's the player controller's responsibility to actually allocate or deallocate those people, or at least it is for the moment. There is a within the real game you can allocate or deallocate kind of the population of that sector. So while in this case we're running everything through the player controller, it's actually going to end up that we need a blueprint for our sector, and everything runs through the sector, because the player owns many sectors, and each sector has its own set of population, own technology level, own research that have been enabled or disabled, or researched or not researched more specifically. But hopefully once we've got a sector running through the player controller, it shouldn't be too difficult to transfer that over to our sector implementation that will come later. So in the original implementation we used a timer, and the timer basically was started by the start allocate, ran at a set interval until the end allocate, and really there's no reason to do it differently, or I haven't identified any other way to do it since, so we're going to work on that same principle. So we're going to start a timer, for the allocation. We're actually going to start the same timer for the deallocation, because you can't be right clicking and left clicking without the stop in between. It should be fine, but we do need to know whether we are adding or removing Now I could have done this by not even having two variables at this, or two inputs at this point, and could have had a variable outside of this being passed in, whether it's a true or a false, add or remove, that kind of thing. But I felt having the events all the way up to this level meant that if I change my mind and it needs to have two different code paths, it's much easier to do it this way. But at the moment we are just going to have a variable which is a boolean of allocate, and we are going to set it when we're there and set it there. It's a bit tight with my placements. I'm going to leave the print strings in for now, but true for allocating, false for deallocating, triggers this event. And much like before, we've got the designer allocation timer, so we'll promote this to a variable and we'll call it the designer. This is all within the designer graph, so in theory we don't need to do that, but I think the variables are shared across all the graphs. Yeah, so unlike a function that has local variables, although the local variables are only applicable during the execution of that function, within the graphs, within a widget in this case, or in the player controller, it has one set of variables that are shared across all the graphs. So we don't want to overdo it with the variables. We'll call it designer allocation timer 2 because I think designer allocation timer is quite a good name. Unfortunately, I can't use the same one without breaking all that code, so we're just going to stick with designer allocation timer 2 until we've replaced that functionality and we can clean up a little bit. So we set that timer. For the stop allocation, we know we really just have to call the clear with that timer, and that's really all we have to do for the stop. It's not anything there. For the set timer by event part, we want to say it's 0.1 like we had before, and it should loop. And I think that's not the one. No. That one. So custom event just gives us that kind of execution point that we want. So we'll call it the on allocate stroke deallocate tick because it doesn't know if it's allocating or deallocating in this context. With this event we don't have any inputs or outputs, but we do have the boolean we set earlier anyway. So in this case we are going to have to branch over the boolean. This might work better perhaps if it was in a function, or just calls a function of allocate, deallocate, depending on various things. I'm not 100% certain. There's also the ability to use a macro for this kind of stuff, but we haven't dealt with macros yet, so and I kind of understand what they are. I did a little bit of research and reading yesterday, but I don't think there's necessarily any benefit with doing that over this approach as it stands. So if we are allocating, so we've started there and now we're over here, we want to add to our designers. And before we did all the logic kind of in line, but I want to just clean that up, and we've got an allocate designers function here, and the stream seems to have been having issues. See if it sorts itself out. I don't think. Don't know if that's back or not. It's still looking like it's in the red. Okay, that should be stable now. Hopefully that's working. Okay, that looks like it's back again. Yep, okay. So when we are allocating, we just call our allocate designers function. And when we are deallocating, we'll call our deallocate designers function, which I haven't got. Yes. So what we were trying to do, or trying not to do, allocate population, yeah, that's what I was going for. Again, I'm trying to keep it so that within the player controller we don't have repetition over assign people to this job or that job during the within the sector, or in this case within the player as a whole as it stands. So it's trying to go for a more generic allocate population function. There's that one. That's function, there we go. And the principle is that we just tell it simply from what do we want to allocate, from where is the pool of people. So in this case that would be our current population amount. There we go, unallocated count. So we want to take from that and we want to put it in our designers count, and we want to move just one person for simplicity. And if we are deallocating, we effectively want to call the same function, but these two are the other way around, and we'll put them there twice just so that it's clear. And we go from the designers to the unallocated pool, and we actually want to move one again. Now we could use the designers and the unallocated count and the designers and put them the other way around and do a -1. Either way would work, but at this point we're doing the variables the other way around, so it's kind of obvious that we're going from the designers to the unallocated, and we're always going by 1. So this function obviously hasn't been implemented. So let's give that a go. So we know we want to remove 1 in all cases, well, in all cases that we've currently done it, and there's another advantage we're not using -1 in the fact that it's kind of just makes the logic of this always consistent. So we want to make sure that from pool of population is greater than or equal to 0. Now if the pool is the population pool, we don't actually want to reduce that to 0. So that's a complication that might require additional code, but for now we'll say if it's greater than or equal to 1, because we do want to be able to deallocate all of the designers. We'll branch on that. If it's true, we want to reduce the from by 1, or actually by the quantity, and then immediately after that we want to increment the 2, not increment, add, by the quantity. If the value is not greater than or equal to 0, we don't do anything. So we don't actually have a visual representation of that. So what we'll do in our designers on that event, which is going to happen like 10 times a second or whatever, but that's not a problem. We'll print the string and print out our designer's count. And we'll do that if we're deallocating as well, just so that it's clear. So now when we click down on here, this one here, it should go up. And now it should go down. It's not quite what we expected. Why did it go up? So we're taking from 2, 1. Take 1 from the from, add 1 to the 2. Maybe the boolean wasn't right then. Don't see any reason why the boolean isn't right, but let's start with that in the designers. Okay, of course. The boolean isn't right because we didn't tie the boolean up properly. There we go. Simple mistake. Goes up, goes down, goes to -1. Goes to -1 because we're saying, is it greater than or equal to 0? That should work. Yep. So you can attempt to deallocate and it will just spin with no actual, well, not spin, it will just not do anything. It might be nicer to not run the timer if there's nothing to deallocate, but there's no harm in running that code, at least not at the moment. So we do have to have a minimum amount. There is only really one case where the minimum amount applies, and that's when we're taking from the unallocated count, but I wonder if that will play any part in it. I don't think that will stop it going down to 0. Start with 10 people. We'll just print out the population instead of the designers. Yeah, it doesn't that range. I think that's probably for editing within a blueprint. It says that if we put in the range, it shouldn't go below 0, but it kind of does. Maybe it's when you set it or something, rather than when you do maths on it. For now, the easiest thing to do is add a variable into this call, which is just the minimum. Tie that up to there. And then in the allocate population, not that one, event graph designers, the minimum in that case would just be 1. And the minimum in this case would be 0. That's not going to be quite right because we're using less than or equal. So we'll change that to a greater than. So if it's greater than the minimum, we can take it away, otherwise we can't. That should mean that our number now doesn't go below 1. Yep. And if we go back up, we don't go below 10. We don't go above 10 even. Okay, so that's the allocation, deallocation of designers kind of all tied up. With one handy little function. We can use that function to allocate population to any job that allows population allocation. We've also got our reallocate population. That was kind of just the big en masse put back population from A to B. That remains the same from yesterday, and we'll call that when the design changes. Just move everything down. So we don't need to print the string anymore, so we'll take that away. Might be worth adding some console logging at some point to say what these values are. Once we are into the business logic of the game, it might make a lot of sense to know kind of consistently what these values are, but equally there'll be the visual representation anyway, so maybe that's not necessary. Okay, so that's the next thing really. We're able to allocate and deallocate the researchers again, but there's no way to see that. So we have within our player controller, and the player controller is what's holding the amount of designers. We still have our changed event that we have added prior, and we could in theory call that changed event. So that we can re-render our task. So, but we want the task doesn't know, as I say, what it's doing. It does have the task type, so you could argue that it does, but I'm not particularly confident about how that works, and I think I might change it. It'd be nice if the task didn't store its type, instead of when it calls things like the mouse down events, it is actually passing that type into them, or would be passing that type into them. In that case, but it just doesn't feel right for this component to know that, and it would be better if that was all handled kind of externally, because the piece that creates this, in this case, or the owner of that widget, the research menu, knows that it's doing research. It knows that it should be showing the time remaining for that design and the amount of designers on that design. That's something that this widget can know, whereas the task is meant to be generic. So to that end, we can, within the event graph for this widget, this code was trying to display the current design time remaining within the timer image, and we could reutilize that for displaying the current design, doing it in the current design. So we can get the current design, and we can call the set allocated population call, and the count will be the player controllers get the designer's count in there. So if we run that, it seems to be working okay. Now, the only downside that I can see is that it's actually happening on every tick. Every tick it updates that text box with the text, even though the text may be the same as it was. I'm not sure quite what optimizations Unreal might do in that case, but we'll assume, at least for the time being, that that will be okay. As we kind of touched upon yesterday, we did create this changed event. We could use the changed event to notify the research menu widget that the player controller has changed its data, and then it could update it then. But changed event's almost too generic, because during the process of the game, almost all the time is something going to change. So we'd still be rendering it too much, and we may even be rendering it just the same amount of time. So for now, we'll stick with this, see how this goes. If we do run into performance issues, or we do feel that we need to improve the performance in this area, it's definitely something that we can easily improve with many different solutions. But if we don't need to improve it, at least at the moment, there's no real benefit in doing so. Now, what we actually get, I think, if I tied it up right, not quite yet, is within the task, it knows that if there are researchers, that value should not be shown. The infinity value shouldn't be shown. And that was the set allocated population call. Let's set time remaining. Okay, so I've basically said if the time remaining is greater than 0, then we should show the appropriate bits. I think that probably makes a little bit more sense. The time remaining is bound to whether the infinity value should be shown, because the time remaining is either going to be 0 or less than 0, or what have we done, greater than 0. Time remaining is 0. No, that's, yeah, see, that doesn't work, does it? Because the time remaining can be 0 when it's finished, but the time remaining won't be 0 just because there's no people on it. So this logic's in the wrong place. So we'll just shove that over there. We want to set the text to the remaining text. We don't care about branching. We don't care about that. Just want to go straight from here to there. So that just sets the text. We'll take that out. That should be in here. So when we've set the population, if that is greater than or equal to, nope, it's just greater than, over there. So we can just simply reuse the logic we've had before. If it is greater than 0, we want to show the text, which is this one, the remaining time text. As visible and the infinity as collapsed, or if it is false, then it's the other way around. So the remaining time isn't set at the moment, but the allocated population is, so we should see that work straight away. See, there's a slight jump in height because the infinity icon is slightly smaller. So we come back over here. We just, yeah, so that with the text is about approximately the same size as this one over here, but with the infinity icon it's slightly lower, so we can add some top padding. To our infinity icon, maybe of 3. 3 didn't work. Don't quite like that. It seems like by adding the top padding to the infinity image, we push the infinity image out. Maybe that works better. Yeah, so I had it centered, so it centers it across the perceived height of that widget, whereas if we just align it to the top, we keep it set to the bottom. But top makes it separate from that, and I don't think that's right. If we jump back to the game and we set, yeah, so the infinity is about in the middle of that text. Now the text font obviously that we've got and that the game's got is not really the same, but we probably want to put that more centered. So we'll do 1 at the top and 2 at the bottom. That means that the timer image is in the same place, but the infinity symbol is more centered to that. Should look about correct. Now if we allocate people, there's still a tiny jump. Maybe 1 more pixel. Put that to the bottom. Hopefully that will be that. Now the whole bottom. This pixel position stuff is a bit frustrating. 2.5, can we do that? There we go. No movement. Much smoother. And actually we need to apply that half a 1 onto the top. That should be all. Okay, so that means it doesn't jump and that infinity shows or hides as it should. Now we want, again, we're going to kind of put it in the player controller just because it's easy to put it in here. But before we were modifying the current design. If the current design is not equal to 0, we simply just reduced the current remaining time by 1 up until the point that the current design was not 0, but that meant it goes into the negative. So we do want to just expand that logic, and we'll also say is greater than 0. So we want that one and that one, and we'll AND them together. And then use that as a condition. So that means that if we've still got remaining time and we're actually researching something, then go ahead and reduce it by 0. But we don't have that I'm doing some research. We haven't propagated that properly. Because it's not the task's responsibility to tell the player controller there's some research going on. It's just showing what we're researching. The research menu still needs to do that. So we're still calling that the on tech icon clicked. We're actually calling the selected available design here, right at the end of the code that we're no longer using. So we'll just bring that back over here. If we successfully find the tech, we set the time, we show that the task widget, and then we tell the player controller what we are researching. So I think we just need to update the allocated time. I think in the player controller, designers, I guess. Start allocate designers. Yep, that one there, the select available design. Find it. That's the reallocation. That's setting the time. So that we should be setting the current design remaining time correctly. In the research menu, do we update that time? No, okay, so we're currently only setting the designers count. We want to call on our current design the set remaining time function as well, not with that value. And that one should mean that our remaining time now is updated and goes from, in this case, 600 I think it was, all the way down in a short amount of time, a lot quicker than it should, but it does it nonetheless, all the way down to 0. And if we, because the way we've tied this up, you can't, removing the people stops the, should stop the process, though I don't think it does. It's not so good when it goes into the thousands. I don't know why it goes into the thousands. There shouldn't be any research that takes that long. Maybe I just... Yeah, okay, so it's 600 because I don't do the division. So the current remaining time is passed straight into the set remaining time, but the set remaining time shouldn't display the entire value, and it also should update the clock. So set remaining time, we need to, where did I put it? It was in the set time image. We have this frames variable. I wonder if we can copy that frames variable over to our set remaining time. No, I think we just copied the node and not the values. see if we can copy the frames here. So we basically just want a local variable in our set remaining time, because set remaining time sets the remaining time value, but it'll also set the clock. There's no reason to call another function to set the clock. So we have a timer frames, we want a paper sprite array, and yep, that's good. We pasted in all those frames. That saves us having to put them all in again, and we'll get that. So once we've set the text, we want to set the frame, but we don't want to set the text directly to the value we've been given, because the value we've given is the total remaining time. So this is where we need to do the division by 12 and the modulus of 12. So we can grab that from over here, wherever we had it before. Here actually, those two values. So the division and the modulus. Now for the division, which one did we put where? This one. Yeah, so it was the modulus we set as the frame. And that one we set directly. We have to make a brush from the sprite. We want it 16 by 16, and then timer image. Set brush. It's all organized. Now let's see if that works. While it is very fast, it does look like it works. As soon as we allocate a person, which does actually take some hard clicking, but we'll get to that in a minute, it does count down from 100, and it does appear, as best as I can tell, that that proper number only goes down when the timer kind of gets round to the top. It certainly stops at 00, about where we want. Now obviously the time is ticking before we got allocated people. So we can go back over to our player controller, into our primary event graph. We're definitely going to have to kind of sort this out to be more logical. But for now, again, we want to get the designer's count. And really, we don't care about whether we are doing a design, whether we have time left, if our designer's count is not greater than 0. So if the designer's count is greater than 0, we'll do an AND just there. It's that one that goes there. We'll just reference that one again just to clean up the graph. So that's basically, if we've got designers and we have a current design and we have a current design remaining time value of greater than 0, then do some work. So now we should see that once we've selected an item, the clock is not moving. As soon as we allocate a designer, the clock starts ticking. Obviously we don't vary the time it takes to do the design based on the people, and the clock is spinning far too fast, but the general logic is all in place. One thing that we do have that we had yesterday was you can't just click on the allocation because it stops it so fast. You never actually allocate the one person. Hopefully we can fix that with fair amount of ease by... This is where we handle the event, and this is where we set up the timer. Unfortunately, at that point we've lost which event we were doing, whether we were allocating or deallocating, and we've got all that kind of bits and pieces in there. Yeah, so it doesn't look like there's a way to stop it after the next go. We could do that. Yeah, so we could do that with a variable, but the problem with that would be that if we did it that way, if the user held it down, they would release and then it would tick over one more, which would be a bit weird. We actually want it to tick once as they click down and then not at all when they release. Not too keen on all that duplication because we can okay, so it's going to be a bit scruffy, but this will certainly work to space these out a bit more. So what I'm going to do is basically run a sequence, one to start the timer in both counts, and then the second point is run your appropriate allocate or deallocate. I say a bit scruffy in terms of the graph, definitely could be a bit cleaner and clear, but that should allow us now to just click. So we can just click and it allocates that one, or we can click down and hold to allocate the rest. So that's much more responsive. You don't have that second delay anymore before it starts. The only thing we need to do is give ourselves all our people back. We're still only running with 10 people. Yeah, there we go. If we go all the way down to 0, it goes back to, so it's exactly where it was. In terms of the clock, I think the actual game doesn't quite do that. If we go down until we get a partial result, gotta let it tick a few times. So yeah, we're kind of halfway around. If we go to 0, it will actually flip back up to full, so we can do that too. Within our task, we can say set the remaining time, which is where we're setting the frame. We can say yeah, so it's here, isn't it? This one is if our allocated population is 0, we hide and show the appropriate thing, but we want to set the remaining time. Now we can't quite do it with the way it's all set up because the frames is actually defined in the set remaining time function. the set remaining time doesn't know that there is no more time. Now we could expand this function so that 0 could be passed in, and if 0 is passed in, the timer frames would be appropriate. But it would also blank the text, even though that's not necessarily a problem. We'll see if using this function works first. We know we want to do set remaining time. That function. And time is 0. Let's see if that works. So now if we allocate a person, take him away, yeah, that doesn't work because it doesn't know how to handle 0. So the frame we actually want is the 0 frame, but I think, yeah, so a divide by 0 would be kind of a no-op type of result. It wouldn't go down this path particularly well. I guess a modulus of 0 probably does similar things. Don't really want to branch this for handling of 0. It seems like it's a bit of an awkward way of doing it. Really all we want to do is set that image. The obvious other choice is to have a set timer image frame input as our index integer, and then we can create a local variable. That should be pretty much set up as it was for the last time we created a local variable. Sprite frames array. Jump back over here. We know we can copy all of these frames and paste them in here, so we don't have to redefine them all. And take that out of there. We want all of that over here. So that just simply sets the frame image icon, and we can call that from here. And pass that frame straight in, so we don't have to do any of the brush creation in this code either. And then we can go into here and set timer image frame, and in this case we know we can just pass 0 in, and that should then work. So we can go up and back down, and it did not work. Why didn't it work this time? It's going to be a bit awkward because it's going to call that all over the place. It's calling it every frame. Putting a breakpoint on there is going to be a bit of a pain, if not impossible. Guess we just want to know what that value is. It's 0 now. It's a whole bunch of numbers, and it's 0 and then it's 1. That is because our Yeah, that is because our research menu, event graph, yep, it sets the allocated population and then it sets the remaining time. And in our task, when we set the remaining time, we set the image, and in our population, set allocated population, we set the image, and just one's overriding the other. It's probably something that we could fix in a better way, but again, a very simple fix in this context is just to simply call them the other way around. Convert them round too, so it keeps it all smart. That means it resets it to 0, and we can see that it calls 7 and then 0. It actually calls it quite a lot before it actually stops calling it, but that's okay. Oh, actually no, it's probably continuing to call it, isn't it? Because the tick on the widget always goes, there's nothing to stop it, even when it gets to there. So we still have that 5050 being streamed down on our output there, and that's because this code doesn't know that it shouldn't update stuff. Definitely, again, as I've said before, some room for improvement here. We could say, well, is the research going on? If the research is going on because all the criteria are correct, then do this on the frame. Otherwise, just kind of set it to this specific state. But you wouldn't want to set it to that specific state more than once, so it gets a bit complicated. Doing it this way around works for now. Shouldn't have too many problems. If we go back to our task, graph, image frame, just take that out, run it again so we don't have all the spam, and it kind of resets into its exact place. And we know that when we continue, it actually continues off from where it left off. It's difficult to say, difficult to see even, but we can certainly see that the number goes down. In each case, it restarts from its appropriate number. So that's all kind of working now. So that means that the selected design stuff is still correct, and allocate designers, these events here, we don't need any of that. So we've replicated all that behavior now. We don't need that. So that's the start allocate designers event, end allocate designers event. So we're just going to get rid of all these event dispatchers that we created for the previous implementation. Don't need those. We're going to keep the selected event for now. Are we? No, I think what we'll do, so to create these ones down here, these entry points that we had, we can just create an event. Not that one, it's custom event. Add custom event, and that gives us that entry point that we want, but we've already got that there. It's just tied up to this binding here. So that's the event dispatcher, which we're going to remove, because we can call the onSelected design from our research menu. If we compile it, we can see that it gets upset because the event dispatcher doesn't exist. But we can see it there, and we can just call it like normal. It just removes that complexity of having that the event, the dispatcher, all that kind of stuff, where we've got access to the player controller within this context. We need access to the player controller to not only begin stuff but re-render the UI, so there's no reason to not just call the function. We don't need any of that, the old implementation. So this is the research menu, so we can fairly confidently now remove the old widgets. So that's all of this we can delete. Canvas panel, current design, that's basically what we want. We'll leave that visible at this point. This bit is the little couple of numbers underneath, which we can delete. And then that's the horizontal box with the current designs in it. We keep the on exit. We keep the on tech icon clicked. We don't need the set timer image. We don't need the get allocated designers text. But we do need the render available technologies. All of our variables are updated based on the change that we've already done. So hopefully I haven't gone crazy and deleted what we need, but looks good. Much cleaner. From the research menu perspective, it's now doing a lot less in terms of variables or widgets that I've defined. The only final thing that we're missing from the previous implementation is if you've got a current, so now we've selected a research and we leave and we enter, we should see that. So we can, within the research menu, it's the research menu's responsibility to say, if you've got a current research, we need to see it. So yeah, it's calling the on tech icon click. I'll see if that actually works. Don't need that one. Perhaps it would be better not to call that function. I think I said that yesterday, because this function actually selects it again, even though by selecting it again we don't actually do anything because it's the same one. But yeah, that gives us the end result we want anyway. So in some ways we've just re-implemented everything we had yesterday, but the end result I think is much cleaner with the result we have now. It's much smoother. It's more functional as well. We have done some improvements over it. Basically the whole task widget now kind of renders and updates and shows everything correctly. The time speeding so fast, that's going to be fixed once we get the proper kind of event loop progress in place. It's going to render the right thing once the right calculations are made and we're saying, well, okay, we reduce the time by how many people, but it ticks always at this constant speed based on the game speed. It's all going to fall into place. So there's nothing really we need to do with that particular part anymore. That task is working. And we also know that there's only a little bit of code within the event graph of the research menu to replicate that behavior in other places. The task doesn't know what it's doing as much as it's simply being told, display this stuff, update with this data, and that's all there is to it. So we can reuse that task widget in new places. Oh, I thought I had this set up so I wouldn't lose. Apparently I did lose. So that's going to be the end for this evening, and hopefully tomorrow we'll look on the next thing. So I think the next thing is going to be probably going back to where this data is actually where the interaction is actually occurring, or perhaps we'll work on another menu, or maybe we could improve the root menu. Perhaps that would be a good solution, because we know that when we've selected a research here, the research should be shown under here. We also could show the population. So yeah, we'll try and address those shortcomings of this menu here. Also need to improve the blank selection here. Once you've actually selected a research, it's not possible to clear it. Not in the real game, nor in this one. But we need to be displaying the tech man here and the little minus sign symbol, but I may put those in place between this stream and next. We've got the values there. Obviously we've got the other menus that we can work on. Perhaps actually completing a research. Yeah, so still lots to do. Figure out what's best to work on next stream. I'm just going to take away these print strings now because a bit untidy. And yeah, that graph is a bit untidy too, but yeah, we'll see what new functionality we can add tomorrow. Hopefully all this is in a fairly decent situation now that we can move forward from our designing and move on to a different aspect of the game. So yeah, thanks for watching. Hopefully see you again, and good night for now.